to the first of this evening's conversations as part of the Summer Science Exhibition. We're here to talk about fake news, filter bubbles, and echo chambers. And since we're on audio, if any of you can't hear us at the back, or if there's too much of an echo, then don't suffer in silence. Please give us a wave or go like that, and then we'll know that you can't hear us. My name is Daniel Glaser. I'm director of a thing called Science Gallery London, which is a new space that's part of King's College that will be opening across from the Shard next year. And you can find us online. I'd encourage you to do so. But that's all you'll hear about Science Gallery probably this evening. We've got just under an hour in each other's company. And we've got three brilliant speakers, each of whom has a completely different perspective on the matter at hand. But since we're going to be talking about fake news, filter bubbles, and echo chambers, I'd like to construct 24 little bubbles or echo chambers in this tent right now. By my count, when I came in, there are 24 tables. And so we're going to take less than a minute, so do it quick. If you don't know the people that you're sat with on the table, introduce yourselves. And then in a word or two, and I really mean that, where do you get your news? Okay? So I'm going to give you a minute on each table. Introduce yourselves if you don't know each other. And share very briefly, it's not a discussion, just like as a matter of fact, where do you get your news? And then we'll tell you the story from this side.
Very nice. Very nice idea. Immediately gets people talking. Excellent.
Okay, so I've not given you enough time. I'll stop you now. I've not given you enough time to finish doing that. Those of you who are interested in sharing, it's a good way of starting things off. I've given you enough time to start, but not to finish. But you'll be pleased to know that we'll come back to you as active voices in about half an hour when you've heard some thoughts from up here. The speakers that we'll be engaging with in reverse order, the first of them, I think, does know on a population level, where you will get your news from, at least. And we'll hear third from Professor Dan Mercea, Senior Lecturer Dr Dan Mercea from City University, who lectures in sociology, political sociology, and has made particular study of exactly the phenomenon that we're interested in. We'll hear second from Sofia Olherde, and she tells me that in terms of her surname, she's in a very, very small bubble, because her grandmother invented her surname because she was bored of sharing a surname with other people in the country where she came from. So she's already constructed for herself a very small bubble to live in. And first we're going to hear from Professor Frith, who's a professor of, what did we say, cognitive development, developmental cognitive science at University College London. And is also, she was at pains to point out to me when we were chatting just now, chair of the Diversity Committee of the Royal Society, which is the body that we're part of. And I guess, Uta, you're going to talk to us a little bit about unconscious bias and what that is. But in some ways, I guess your motivation for being interested in what you're going to talk about is connected to your chosen role in the Diversity Committee. So each of our speakers is going to go for about 5 minutes. We may kind of chat a little, we'll talk among ourselves, and then we'll come to the floor. You know, I don't mind, because it's quite a formal institution, if you give Uta a small round of applause to encourage her just as she starts. Professor Uta Frith.
Thank you. Gosh. Well, in the world of social media, just like in the primal village, we create our own bubble. This is to learn from others like us, rather than having to make our own mistakes. And our unconscious biases act as navigators to this bubble, and they lure us in because we feel safe inside it. And there are a whole string of these biases. And you can look them up in Wikipedia. And I will just mention a few that I think are particularly relevant for our topic tonight.
But just before you do, can we make sure that we understand what, I think we mean technically, because you're here as a professor of the thing, what you mean by a bias and what you mean by an unconscious bias. Not like a whole lecture, but just to make sure we kind of get what that is. What's a bias for you?
Well, you know, when you weigh things, you want to know the truth. You want to know which is heavier. But if you have a weight that is consistently overestimating things, that's a bias.
Okay. So it's quite close to the natural language sense of it that you're
absolutely,
using.
absolutely.
And unconscious, do you want, I mean, we're not going to define the unconscious, life's too short, but what do you mean by an unconscious one?
Most of our mind is working completely unconsciously, but we do have a tiny bit that's our conscious mind, and that believes it's in charge of everything. And, you know, for centuries, perhaps for millennia, people thought it's just that conscious mind that counts, that it's all. But we now know that a lot of heavy-duty work goes on in our unconscious mind. And of course, there are connections between the conscious and unconscious mind, and the two don't always see eye to eye with each other.
Good. So it feels to me as if your understanding of these professionally is quite close to the common understanding in the room, and that's helpful.
So.
Good. Thank you.
So let's start with something called in-group bias. I'm very interested in that. It seems that we really feel warm if we are in a kind of blanket with people who are like us. We love to be among like-minded people in informal clubs. So tonight we are all scientists, or at least interested in science. And then there is something called conformity bias. And that means something like when we feel compelled to do as others do, to want the same things as others do, if we identify with them. So
this means that even the people who aren't scientists here tonight are going to nod when you say that they're scientists, because they want to fit in with all of the...
I think if 1,000 people have come tonight to the Summer Science, then we can't be wrong being here. Now, the other bias, which is interesting, is called an optimism bias. So we believe that good outcomes are more likely than poor outcomes. And why not? I mean, if we didn't believe that, we probably wouldn't do anything. We would be too depressed. And related to this is the superiority bias. And that is that we believe we are better scientists, we are better listeners, better speakers than other people. So, there are some other biases, and I will mention them that are relevant, but basically they're all shortcuts. The unconscious mind, and they help us process large amounts of information very quickly, which is wonderful. But there's a downside. They prevent us from finding out that truth about the world, or for the scientists, they prevent us from creating a better model of the world. They let us make stupid mistakes, taking wishful thinking for reality, and they bypass huge opportunities. Imagine not learning from another group in another bubble who may just have invented the wheel. So the mind has evolved in this way to use these shortcuts, to use these biases, so let's not feel defensive or guilty about them. So what about the alternative? Well, that's when we have to talk about the conscious mind. And I've already said it's not completely separate. And there is a mixed relationship. Sometimes they're in cahoots together, and sometimes they're sort of at war with each other. The main thing to point out about the conscious mind is that it's much more limited in capacity than we like to think. It's one thing at a time, essentially really slow and probably really lazy. And it makes mistakes. So perhaps in gratitude for not being bothered too much, our conscious mind is eager to justify shortcuts in decision-making with a whole edifice of post hoc reasons. It's eager to justify our bad behavior, our lies about our own superiority, moral goodness. But sometimes, of course, it can make us stop and think. And hey, we don't have to reinvent the wheel just because it was an invention of an outgroup. We do better if we free ourselves from old models that served us well at one point in our history. So science is the prime example, because that's shown that we do well to constantly try and improve the models of the world. Very demanding. It means getting out of the bubble, but no pain, no gain. Social bubbles, I believe, have always been with us. Social media have created, however, far more bubbles, far bigger bubbles than the primal village ever imagined, because the primal village has become the global village. So what about fake news? Well, I would like to talk about pseudoscience, which I think is very similar phenomenon. Fake news, pseudoscience are not new either. We may not like the news we get, we like the data that fit, and we find excuses for data that do not fit into hypotheses. So of course, scientists are trained to do this. This is the confirmation bias that we have to fight against. We are trained from day one to work against it all the time. Here's an experiment. In the US, very recent, people who identified themselves as liberals or as conservatives were given a chance to win $10 by reading 10 questions and answers arguing for the other side, and $7 for reading those questions and answers that were arguing for their own side. What did they do? Any ideas? Well, the arguments from the other side. And moreover, it was true for liberals as much as for conservatives. Why? Why do we do this? Well, one idea is that we hate to abandon the illusion that we share a common reality. I think that's a critical point probably in all our discussion. Many people have discovered they can use social media for justifying gut reactions of their in-group. So we tend to follow on Twitter or Facebook like-minded people, and also we do almost anything not to get expelled from our in-group, the group we want to belong to. If we are attacked by members of our in-group, then we are likely to work even harder. For example, retweeting people, possibly becoming more extreme to show they're indeed a loyal and real member of the group. And we do need this shared reality to feel in touch with each other and to trust each other. And trust is very dependent on reputation, and reputation is fed by word of mouth, by social media these days, and in other words, gossip. An experiment showed that if we hear bad things about others, or for that matter, good things about other people, then we tune down our observation powers. We downweight the actual experience. So the fake news from social media and the pseudoscience really does affect our perception. The trouble with the new fake news, the new pseudoscience, is that it's so good at masquerading itself as legitimate. It's disseminated on a global scale. So I'm interested in, for example, this idea that vaccines supposedly cause autism. It's thoroughly discredited. But if you are a believer, you can easily find papers that support this discredited view, papers that are published in international journals, but of course of very dubious origin, and people can cite them in the way you cite any scientific paper, and as if it were a rigorous scientific study. Of course, the same goes for such topics as climate change or GM foods. So what's new with the social bubble is that they're really interacting with these lies, these fake news. So people inside our own bubble, our own followers, will cite the studies because they support their beliefs and it seems they must be true. We tend to believe, and this is my last sentence, that we get this, if we get the same information repeatedly, that it comes from independent sources. But that may not be true.
Thank you very much, Uta. We can applaud for the thing. And can I just ask, I mean, so you're somebody who studies the phenomena in all of our brains, which seem to underlie the social phenomenon of fake news. Does that mean you're more tolerant of people who are stuck in their bubbles than if you didn't understand the brain science behind it?
I think I'm more curious, but not necessarily more tolerant.
Very good. So look, there is something new happening, at least on a technical level. and the ways we're connected, which are driven by new technology, both electronic, technical technology and social technology, I think are different clearly than they were 10, certainly 50 years ago. And Sofia, you're a professor of statistics. What's going on with, are these technical devices that observe social media and the fake news wave, are they truly new? Do we understand what's happening with them? Tell us what you know about that.
Yes, hopefully you can hear me all the way at the back. So first, just to answer your question of what's new. Well, what's new is that we have access to a lot more data, and we have access basically to computers which are able to process a lot more data. So many of the techniques and ideas that are being used today was available in the 1980s, but couldn't be used or implemented because we didn't have as much data about individual people, or indeed about a whole population of people, and we wouldn't have been able to process that data even if it had been available. So many of these things, it's not that there's been a step change in how we should process data. What's really changed is the amount of data that we have available to us.
Okay, and just to be clear on this, the machinery that Uta's studying, we reckon is probably the same machinery, right? So the step change has not been in terms of how we're processing things cognitively or biologically. It's to do with the technology externally. Okay. Do we understand what's happening?
Yes, I think at the very high level, we see the broad landscape of what's going on. So let's just separate out a few concepts to start with. So we're talking about echo chambers and filter bubbles. What are these two things? Well, basically, an echo chamber is a set of individuals who are reinforcing the same opinions, and where the same opinions get reflected back. A filter bubble is the mechanism where people in this bubble only get information or news that conform to the information that's already available to them. We've all heard about it. There's been Brexit, there's been American elections, and all other sorts of elections. Anything that we collect and want to understand more of in terms of information. So basically, how we understand this information is we use computers who have set recipes, which could be like your recipe for cooking stroganoff, to create information from the input of the data. And what's at the heart of echo chambers and filter bubbles? What at the heart is basically a set of recipes or executable steps that came from online shopping. So at the heart of it is really a recommender system. If you bought this book by Tom Clancy, well, indeed, you should go ahead and buy this book by Jeffrey Archer. That's that set of steps, the mechanical inputs that the computer has to calculate from and the steps it has to go through that is creating the filter bubbles is the same technologies as that. Well,
and you use that, it's the same technology, you're describing it starting that way because in the history of this technology, that was the first application of these algorithms.
Exactly.
Okay, gotcha.
Exactly.
Right.
So what is at the heart of this? Well, we like to think of having a set of people. Well, a set of people can just be a set of entities. And these sets of peoples, they're really interacting with the other set of entities. So you could have, for instance, books on one axis, books as something people might be reading or not reading, hating or loving. And on the other side, you've got people. And if you want to figure out whether you should recommend me a new book, well, you might try to see what are all the other books that I liked? What are all the other things that I seem to be enjoying being in the company of or liking? So you're basically trying to identify groups of people. And those groups of people, we decide that they're similar because they seem to like the same thing. And that is at the heart of a recommender system, because the recommender system is just trying to come up with things that I might like. So what the algorithm does, it finds new ways of using the inputs of what other things I like with what other people who are also looking at books or movies might have liked before. And that is at the very heart of a filter bubble, because you can take out the movie or the book and you can input instead what newspaper articles did I click on, or indeed what websites did I go on. And this is not really restricted to liberal or conservative. In fact, New York Times, that well-known left-leaning paper, every day sends me recommendations. Well, if you like these articles that we've seen you read, you might also like those, which, because I'm a contrary woman, immediately makes me want to go off and read anything but those.
Okay. And it sounds like that might be a good recommendation to take away if we want to escape. I'm interrupting you only because you're a mathematician, right,
Yes.
or a statistician. I guess the phenomena that we're looking at globally are quite interesting, and the network behaviors. But in terms of the algorithms that are being used to do the process, so
Yes.
the things that think, this is a slightly dumb question, but as a mathematician, are they interesting algorithms or are they dumb algorithms, these sort of referrer things?
They're both, actually.
Well, their consequences are interesting, but the thing itself is interesting?
They could be. So I said that many things haven't changed because we just have more data and we're capable of processing more data. Well, one thing that has changed is that algorithms have become more complex. So the watchword of the hour, if you go out and speak to computer scientists working in this area, is called deep learning. And Northern try to look very intelligent. One of the interesting aspects about deep learning is that it has a set of rules that it executes one after the other. But one of the problems is that each step affects the next step. That means that it's impossible to mathematically analyze exactly how the deep learning system comes up with a recommendation or a way of clustering people or classifying you as a romance reader or whatever it's trying to come up with, because there are too many complex steps using too much data that you can't actually figure out why it came up with a specific recommendation. And if you took away the data, you have no clue why it came up with a particular recommendation.
So you're saying even the people running the systems that do the choice of the news stories you read or the recommendations, even the people running the system don't know why it's chosen
Yes.
the things it's choosing to recommend?
Yes.
Okay, good.
And the slightly interesting thing is you might think that it couldn't be transparent or explainable to you because I'd start to use mumbo-jumbo jargon which had mean square error, prediction error, and all these sorts of things in it. No, it's not that. It's because the data is so big that there's so many ways of combining it in complex ways that a human can't understand why it came up with a particular decision. And this can get very complex because with data, you can get information you're not aware of that you're using. So you might say, oh, I'm not going to use gender when I make this decision. I'm going to take out all of the gender information. Oh, but I actually left all of the shopping history of this person in. And they went and bought high-heeled shoes at LK Bennett. And then they went off and bought romance literature online from Amazon, etc., etc., etc. And if you make that complicated enough, even nonsensical things can seem to have a power of performance for prediction because they're related to other things. And when data gets into very large volumes, things mathematically
correlates with gender, be a problem. I'm going to ask you one question for a very quick answer, and then we're going to go to Dan, and then we're going to have more discussion. Is there a statistical or a mathematical definition of a filter bubble and an echo chamber in terms of the ways in which people are connected? In other words, it's all over the newspapers that we've got filter bubbles and echo chambers, and that's why these things are happening that are happening in the world. But as a statistician who studies these networks, have you noticed, is there a definition of a new thing which is now happening in networks that wasn't true 5 or 10 years ago?
So it's sad to say, but mathematicians and statisticians are often 5 years behind computer scientists. I never said that in public.
I think it is being recorded, but that's okay.
Computer scientists are ahead there and they study interesting phenomena, they come up with algorithms, but the statisticians and the mathematicians come afterwards, mess up the mop once they get that far ahead. And you need a mathematician to come up with a definition normally. And so, no, we don't have a good definition exactly what it is. And when we do, it's going to be easier to solve ways of mitigating the effects.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Sofia. We'll give her a quick round of applause. So Dan is a political sociologist, and I guess part of that humanities cluster, which we were joking about whether he can become an FRS, Fellow of the Royal Society, in the end. Apparently not. There's a place just on the other side of the steps there, the British Academy. That's where his stuff goes on. But you know, social science is the science of the 21st century, my friend. So there is something to learn from it also. Dan, there's some history here as well, though, isn't there? Yeah. Because although we're talking about it like it's a phenomenon of now, as Uta alluded to in her remarks, this stuff has been going on in some senses for quite a while. Tell us about it.
Yes, so there are 4 points, really very short points that I'd like to make. And the first one is to do with a question that was asked at the very beginning, which is how do you get your news? And in the mid-20th century, the idea was that news organizations use what's called metaphorically a hypodermic needle. And they mainline information to audiences, and that sways audiences one way or the other. Now, since then, of course, there have been other contrarians who have said, well, that might not necessarily be the case. So they've gone about looking at how media content is being diffused, how it disseminates, right? And the finding that, the main finding then was that there are opinion leaders who basically, through interpersonal contact, will shape other people's ideas and views on, for instance, politics. And this is crucial when we think about what interpersonal relations actually do. And they tend to homogenize opinion as well as action. And that's true for members of the in-group, the people that you interact with. And that's also very significant when we think about how we deal with unclarity and uncertainty. So this homogenization tends to happen when we're faced, for instance, with a very significant choice, such as in an election. And then we turn to opinion leaders and we ask them, so who should I vote for? Who do I believe in? And so on and so forth. And so it's a question of trust, really, fundamentally, that we need to look at when we try to understand what happens with filter bubbles. Now,
can I just say, so Sofia could study that, right? So what you've just described of there being a small number of opinion leaders, if you drew the network diagram of opinions, there'd be a small number of nodes where the opinions start,
yes,
and they would flow out to a much larger group of people who are connected in, that would have network properties which we can come back to. But that's quite a strong analysis of the situation.
Okay. We would call them influentials these days on social media.
Okay.
Now, so this leads me on to the second point, which is to do with how the early internet age rhetoric about echo chambers was all very positive, and we didn't speak of echo chambers, we spoke of communities of interest. And what was important about communities of interest was that they facilitated the sort of construction of close bonds of trust, right? So I trust someone because we have the same interests, we have the same avocation, if you want, we have a mutual avocation. And so that helps us navigate content, right? So fundamentally, we're looking from the point of view of the user, we're looking at ways in which we can expedite this process and also deal in this day and age with what we call information overload. So the fact that we've got so much information coming our way that it's difficult to pass it. It's difficult to make sense of it all. So then we again fall back on these so-called communities of interest, and we sort of tap into that common knowledge, which is something that actually quite a few people praised in the early days of the internet. So that was the early days rhetoric, and we seem to have gone off that. I guess the advantage of communities of interest is diversity. The more diversity you have, the larger the argument pool, as someone, an American sociologist argued. The larger the argument pool is, and that actually, you know, if you look at the global picture, that's actually a positive development. The way around, I guess one of the ways around this problem that we're increasingly locked in these filter bubbles would be to have multiple group membership. So you have someone who's a member of this bubble and also the next bubble, let's say, and that cross membership helps people disseminate multiple views. But filter bubbles are here to stay for these main reasons. The other point I wanted to make, so the third point, is to do with the dissolution of traditional forms of association. So we've seen that since the since the transformation in the economy and the post-industrial transformation, the fact that most of us work in the service sector, so we don't really do we don't really get jobs in the manufacturing sector. One thing that has happened is the dissolution of workplace, civic, social, and crucially place-based associations, right? So that basically was an issue for many people. So the workaround has been to harness, if you want, the internet and use it to scale up these communities of interest faster and over wider expanses.
So people had, as it were, working men's clubs or the pub after work or the canteen.
Exactly.
And these were place-based. So this was, they had an enforced diversity from the... Okay.
That's right. So that's something that we've noticed. And so a workaround for people has been to sort of congregate around what we would call opinion-based groups, which basically work on the basis of validating ideas about how the world should be. Right. So if you share the same worldview, as we call it, then you're part of our group. You're a member of the in-group, right? And so that then is a way of coping with this this macro structural transformation that we've seen in contemporary society. And the final point is about fake news. And the problem with fake news is not so much that there is fake content out there, and obviously that's a judgment that we have to make. It's a judgment call. The problem is with the impact that news that is decontextualized, that is fundamentally sort of based on leaps of logic, for instance. The fundamental problem with that kind of disinformation is that it decredibilizes all information. Right? So it's very difficult for us to tell apart what is disinformation from information. Mm-hmm. And so a big mission here that social actors have is to try and help us navigate this maze. And the best placed organizations are media organizations. And the first thing they would need to do is to actually not give any airtime to disinformation. Mm-hmm. Right? So not to credibilize that kind of information. And I'll leave it at that.
Cool. Thanks, Dan. So again, my compliments to the Royal Society for having brought together three different people who have very different bits of the puzzle of how we got to the state we're in. And I'm going to, for this first bit of the discussion, I'm going to assume that we all agree that there is a problem right now, right? That it's a different problem than was the case 5 or certainly 10 years ago. If we have time at the end, we can have the contrarian view that it was always like this and we're just panicking and everyone should chill out and go back to their online shopping. But let's assume there is a problem. I think we've got three candidate, it's not Cluedo, but three candidate sources of problematicity. The problem could be driven by the unconscious biases in our own brains, right? The way we see the world, the way we process information. As Uta said, the fact that most of what we do is not available for inspection to ourselves, and that there are these inbuilt biases which are there. It could be that we lay the blame at Sofia's door, which is to say that there are new network properties of the algorithms which were designed for one purpose, but for commercial reasons are now being applied to other problems which they weren't designed to solve. And there was some unpredicted network consequence of the application of these algorithms which has caused the mess we're in. And we could believe that this is all political and social, that the forces of either commerce or politics have driven the systems into places they shouldn't otherwise be, and it's actually politics that's put us where we are. So before we come to the discussion, I'm going to go back to your tables for less than a minute each, and I'm assuming you all still remember who each other are. I want you to ask each other, who do you blame out of the three pantomime villains that we've lined up for you this evening? Who do you blame for the mess we're in? And then we'll come to questions on the subject. And we can talk up here. We'll mute the mics up front for a second, who we blame among ourselves. What do you think happened? Everyone should be. You think there's an algorithm problem here, fundamentally? So you're taking the blame? No, clearly, but the technical domain? Okay. Right. Uta?
Well, I still think that, we have this craving to have this shared
Okay, great. So, like I said, I've not given you enough time to finish because this is the discussion. I'm going to ask up front just quickly who these guys blame. I think I was quite surprised at what they were hinting at just now. Uta, is the fault within ourselves? Is it all the fault of the brain? Is that what's really gone wrong here?
Yes. We can't blame anyone else but ourselves.
All right,
that's what I think.
Sophia, is it the algorithms? You're holding your hand up on this one?
I think the algorithms have contributed just because they're very, very efficient and they speeded things up tremendously.
Okay, they speeded up a thing which was happening anyway, and the thing. Dan, who do you blame?
Well, it's very hard for us to cope with information overload. So in effect, I blame ourselves as a community, as social beings, because we take that shortcut.
But I mean, you study politics, right? There are political entities who have as an explicit goal to devalue conventional media and have a state policy in some cases. And I'm actually nicely not pointing to any one country because I can think of at least two whose governments are trying to do this right now, spreading information which is incorrect for political reasons. So do you think that that's what's actually behind what's...
Well, as I said, yes, that complicates, if you want, the landscape in the sense that it really makes things more difficult to disentangle what is disinformation from what is accurate, truthful information. So yes, that really does have a negative impact.
All right, we're going out. So we've got two mics. They're going up the aisles, one side and the other side. Keep it brief, folks. We've got 20 minutes, so I want to hear as many voices as possible. Be polite. And be open. Sir, the front here will go. Yep. So I think you should take an aisle each. And I want someone at the back. Who else at the back's going to come in after that? Wave your hands if you want to speak. Okay, go.
Hi. Can we blame global warming for a lot of this problem? Because it was the first one where there was a massive campaign to ignore the experts or discredit the experts. Can we blame that approach on then the feedback on everything since?
What do you reckon? I mean, is that your hunch?
A little.
Okay.
It's the biggest disinformation campaign of recent times.
And to that extent, you're agreeing with Uta that actually this, I mean, it's not, it's Royal Society, isn't it? So, but the pseudoscience thing was actually where the fake news started to go off. Yeah, okay, nice. We probably have someone at the back, yep.
Right. I would like to say that my view is that the blame can be put on all three factors. It's very smart people, influencers, who know how to use the technology to exploit the weakness of our brains for their goals, whatever they are.
Okay. Do you reckon that the people designing the algorithms study cognitive science? I'm going to ask these two in a minute. But you're making an interesting claim, which is that they're actually exploiting weaknesses in our biological operating system to accomplish the goals that they want to technically. Is that the thought that you...
Yes. The technical people who design algorithms, they're not necessarily directly to blame, but they might be designing tools not really thinking through what the consequences of using those tools will be.
Okay, cool. And I think we are wondering, Dan, aren't we, whether it's sort of deliberate or not. Ma'am.
This question's more directed at Uta than the rest of you, sorry. But I was wondering do you think that studying unconscious bias has helped you better tackle it or to identify it? And if it has helped you tackle it, do you have any advice for others who feel like they would like to better manage that?
Cool. So let's have a go at those. Uta, do you want to come on that one to start with?
Okay.
Yeah. What can we do?
It's a really difficult question. It'd be wonderful to say yes. Having studied this and invested this, and now I know what we're going to do about it. But no, the answer is no, not at all. It's an incredibly difficult problem, and as I said to you, it's not a question of throwing out this unconscious bias that we might have. We can't do it. In fact, we should really say that's how we are built. But we have a few tricks, and one of them is diversity. If you have different viewpoints, if you make a decision, then you can have a much bigger space for possible solutions. So that's a very good thing, but it takes longer time. It's much less comfortable to do so, but it is actually really helpful if you want to get good solutions, if you want to really explore the sort of problem space. If you don't need to make an absolute split-second decision, then I would say yes, diversity is the answer. there are other things that we should consider, and that has to do with being more monitoring, about what we are doing, what's going on. And one interesting thing there is that we can't monitor ourselves as well as we can monitor other people. It's very, very interesting. It's the idea that we can see the fault in the others very, very easily and not in ourselves. So I'm trying to possibly, encourage a kind of trusting relationship where you can point out problems in each other, because we're just not good at doing it for ourselves.
Okay. A couple of technicals there. Just, Sofia, you mentioned the contrarian thing of buying books which you weren't recommended on Amazon or your favorite online bookstore. Does a knowledge of the way these algorithms work help you to defeat them?
Yes and no, because it's not just a mathematical problem. So in a sense, we could start to recommend things which were more diverse, that came from other parts of the population. But the problem is that as people are more comfortable with things that agree with their own views, they would just not click on the recommended item or would not go along with it. So yes, I think we do need to understand the technical details of what makes it work, and that will help, but it's not the easy solution.
Okay, so you're just as vulnerable as somebody who isn't a professor of computer science or statistics?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, okay. And Dan, we've got a kind of climate change started it all thing, and we've also got a is it deliberate or an accidental consequence of other things thing. Do you have a view on either of those?
Well, what we've noticed in terms of politics is that politics have become more polarized, and this is a secular trend. So it's been happening for decades now, and it's pretty marked in the US. And so political leaders are uncooperative. They don't want to sit down and talk through their issues, and they just want to speak to their base, as it were. And that trickles down, I suppose. That there is evidence to suggest that this is happening. So polarization starts at the top, and then it trickles down, I suppose.
Very nice. Okay, gentleman in blue, and I think we may have someone in the. Is the woman there? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Go.
Is there a way in which we can know whether or not we are open-minded, given that all the narrow-minded people I know think that they're open-minded?
Right. So this is the superiority bias as well. Yeah. At the back, and then I'll take gentleman behind. Yeah.
So playing the villain for a minute, would it be in our society's advantage, by any chance, to have echo bubbles and filter chambers?
What are the possible benefits of this thing? Yeah. So can we know? And I'll take one more, and then we're going to have to get some women in the next round. But yeah, go on, sir.
Clearly, when Facebook recommends something for us, we know the algorithm is involved. But how much are we being unconsciously affected by the algorithm in the way that it filters posts from our friends, where we think we're seeing everything?
All right. So we're being fooled by the Okay.
Well, are we or aren't we? I don't know.
Yeah.
Does anybody know the answer to that?
Okay.
No, I don't know.
Do you want to take the first one, Uta? Can we tell if we're suffering from bias?
Well, I've given the example of that experiment where liberal people, people with a very liberal persuasion were compared to those with a very conservative persuasion. And the idea was that the liberal people will be more tolerant. They will actually hear the arguments from the other side. And that just wasn't the case. So I think the polarization that Dan spoke about probably goes very, very deep. And I think we could make an effort to overcome this. To me, it seems not impossible that we should really learn from, history how you can have mediation between warring parties. You don't have to always be at complete conflict, never listen to each other. There is again the idea that maybe we should have a layer, a sort of independent kind of body, which would say, well, you can talk to this person, rather than asking the people from the groups themselves to rise above themselves, which is probably too much to ask.
And Dan, I'll bring you in, but also I wonder this interesting point about Facebook, and do we have a tendency, as it were, to trust Facebook not to be messing with our heads? And is our trust in these institutions, what you talked about conventional media companies changing, but tell us what your evidence says.
Well, what we know so far is that Facebook is not really living up to its responsibility, its social responsibility. So the way in which it tweaks the PageRank algorithm is not civic in any way. It's not civically minded. It's really just there for profit, to generate advertising income. And so it's very difficult to trust something that is not working for you in the sense that it's not giving you the public information that you would want to be exposed to, for instance, when you're looking for political content ahead of an election. But what I wanted to say was that even if we actually expose ourselves through deliberation to competing views, some research that I'm quite interested. I've been quite interested in, and seems remarkable in the findings that I'm going to quote, suggests that actually, if we look at deliberation from divergent standing points, what happens is that there seems to be an entrenchment rather than a convergence when deliberation takes place.
Okay, so explain what you mean by that.
So what I mean is that we fall back on the opinion, we listen to other people, and then that actually makes us reinforce the ideas that we
the more diverse the views we're exposed to, the more we become entrenched.
entrenched.
Oh, no.
And so, but what the plus side though is that we also become more aware of other people's opinions, and potentially more respectful of them. So it's not all bad, right? We learn how to be civil by engaging in deliberation,
okay, so
even though we might become more entrenched in our views.
All right. Although with Uta's superiority bias, we learn that, they're idiots, but we have to be nice to them. Okay.
That's not a bad political outcome.
Okay.
We talked a little bit, someone brought up climate change. Well, the first industrial revolution brought about a lot of behavior that people later found out was irresponsible, as in using up natural resources and creating a lot of pollution. We are definitely in a situation where society is changing very rapidly, and we are starting to let automated decision rules, algorithms run wild in our natural lives. It doesn't seem very far-fetched to go from the first industrial revolution to now and ask, well, if we look at our experience of being forced to regulate, so we leave a society that's cleaner, I mean, this is another form of pollution. It just takes another shape.
So you're saying that the unregulated use, as it were, of fossil fuel technology in the first industrial revolution, we're now realizing we should have controlled. Perhaps we should learn from that and regulate more. Okay, interesting. And just quickly on the question that was raised about whether there are positive attributes to these bubbles, we've, I think, framed them in value terms in this proposition as negative. But as a statistician or a mathematician, are you secretly really proud of what we've achieved with these algorithms? I mean, are there positive sides to what's going on?
Of course, they're super cool, right? They work really well, and now we can do things on a scale that's completely unprecedented. It's amazing, right?
Okay. You're quite convincing, so you actually think that.
And they're incredible efficiencies, efficient and saving of energy, right? You don't have to go and look what all these other people think about book and movies. You can just get the book and movies you want immediately, like you'd like. So for many different problems, there are incredible savings that could be had by using data to come to conclusions more quickly, and by saving basically efforts in coming to a decision that you would have made anyway, and where the data could have told you that quicker.
All right, we'll come back into you in the end as to whether being allowed to just follow our biases is progress or not. I believe there's a woman there on the side,
Oh, hello. I just wanted to say about Twitter versus Facebook, and just wondering whether we can sort of, if there's any point in bothering with Facebook, because Twitter, you can follow anyone, but Facebook, you at least have to pretend to be friends with them.
All right, well, we'll do the Twitter and Facebook wars over cocktails afterwards. But I mean, Twitter does choose what stories come up on your feed almost as much as Facebook does. The gentleman there, and then we'll go to the lady at the front. Yeah.
So much of what you've discussed so far is how this kind of model keeps a steady state, so reinforcing opinions and hearing that echo chamber. But I mean, even quite recently, we've seen that public opinion can shift quite wildly. So I wanted to know, how does that mechanism work in this model? Do the bubbles change their outlook, or do you splinter off, find a new bubble? How have we observed that, and do we understand how it works?
Yeah, I'm really interested in that. So what's the dynamics of it? We'll take one more, and then Sofia, you can tell us what it looks like statistically.
Hi, I'm curious about the idea of deliberation leading to entrenchment, because I've certainly found online I often seek out opposing opinions, but people are so rude about them that it's really easy to dismiss when you read online someone deliberately ignoring your side, someone being very rude. So I'd be curious about deliberation in online settings and deliberation in in-person settings.
Okay. Can I just do on a show of hands here? And by the way, just to be clear on this, I'm assuming that we have a diversity of political views, from liberal or other conservative, pro and anti-Brexit. I'm assuming that we have a diversity here, so I don't want to make any assumptions of your own particular senses. But on a show of hands, who here has actively sought out online political views which differ from their own? Who's actually set out one morning? Okay, who's never set out to find somebody who really thinks differently than they socially and online? I'm not sure I have really set out. Okay, so the majority claim to have done it. Who wants to take some of those questions? Dan?
Well, that's called social desirability at play. I mean, we're talking about an issue that obviously invites us to say that we are actively trying to combat this problem.
Okay.
So yeah, as social scientists, we would probably discuss that further.
Sure.
But what I wanted to say in terms of social norms, in terms of deliberation, online deliberation, the difference. Sorry, I'm leaning this way because the mic's on this side. The difference would not be a significant one necessarily between deliberation online and offline, because it all boils down to what sort of social norms are being enforced online and offline, right? So in theory, we can discuss about how that enforcement happens online, and there's catching up maybe to do, but it will eventually happen once the technology beds down. But at the most basic level, this is a question of social norms and how we enforce them. And the other thing I wanted to say, and this
By the way, you're louder for them than you are for you, so don't worry.
Yes, okay, good.
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that.
Okay, cool. I mean, do we know? So I remember small world networks being discussed a few years ago. I mean, do you guys make beautiful diagrams of what these bubbles look like? Are there good formalisms to describe them and stuff?
Yes. So, for instance, Twitter, you can define networks by saying that two people tweeting are linked if they retweet the same Twitter post or if they tweet about the same things. And what you get then is really a network of people who are interested in the same things or retweet the same thing, which is evolving across time. And the interesting aspect is to see that evolution, which is very, very interesting. And there is no real good mathematical theory at the moment to understand the phenomena that were raised earlier. I've heard psychologists sometimes say that the bubbles make people entrenched because they think the bubble has the range of all opinions, and as they only see a small amount of them, it forces them towards the middle of that bubble rather than all of the ones they could have seen, which is contrary to what you just said, so I should stay in my lane probably. But the mathematical models that would help us model these characteristics still do not exist.
Okay. And just I know you want to come in on this, but I've got a little one for you as well. I mean, most of what you've done in your professional life has involved one head at a time, or maybe a pair of heads. And there are some cognitive scientists who think about, group size and stuff. But, I mean, is there a hope for cognitive science to start dealing with these kind of network effects in a systematic way? Or do we need to leave it to the mathematicians and the social scientists?
Oh, I think we should work together. There is indeed a growing realization that, we're not individuals alone in a world, but we are deeply social creatures.
So in a sense, the research that you're doing ought to be driven a little bit by the crises of today. If we're all really worried about this, shouldn't cognitive scientists be cognitive neuroscientists be trying to find, if not solutions, at least ways of understanding these phenomena?
Yes.
From biological or
I completely agree. I completely agree. I think it's the most exciting topic to be studying, but it's not going to be easy. It's incredibly complex, and as you've already alluded, we're probably always behind what's actually happening. But our understanding, I think, is increasing. And it is very interesting. There was one question about why is it that sometimes people do change their minds? Why did we, for example, have this amazing success with stopping smoking when there was a lot of pseudoscience there and a lot of fake news beforehand saying, oh, no, it has nothing to do with cancer, kind of, published article somewhere. Well, suddenly things changed. I don't think we know how that happened, and I think that would be really amazingly interesting to study. But I did want to say just one thing. We're talking about bubbles, probably because we all know that they're very fragile things and they burst eventually. So there is something about this whole concept that lets us say, well, that we're not really stuck in them. We might be for a time, but sometimes they will have to burst.
Sofia, I know that most of your work is done in an academic context at UCL, but you also do some commercial work. I mean, is it all hands to the pump? I mean, in your domain, are you looking for solutions to these problems? Are you engaging in your work with either understandings of or solutions to the problem which many of us feel is pressing right now?
I think that, unfortunately, the reason one is, as a mathematician, really wanting to work on these problems is that the underlying maths is very beautiful.
Good.
So, and it's just bringing up complex and really difficult scenarios that people haven't thought of before. And I also think that most mathematicians want to get out of their ivory towers and do something to improve society as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
So interestingly enough, the British government, parts of it, are also trying to use modern mathematical techniques to improve the amount of value they can deliver in society. So I think there are probably going to be more mathematicians running amok and trying to help.
Good. Dan, I mean, do you sense a crisis currently? Is your work being better funded and more prominently reported as a result of the current preoccupation with this stuff?
There's a bit more attention, yes, but the fundamental problem that we have, certainly in the social sciences, is access to data. So because this is commercial data that we're talking about, with the exception of Twitter, but Twitter has got restrictions in terms of how much data you can get without having to pay for it. There's very little that we can, for instance, say about Facebook, right? So it's, you know, it's disingenuous to go to the academics and say, what can you tell us about what's happening with big data? Because we haven't got access to most of the data that's you know,